Hello guys, welcome to another video. So on this video we're going to be covering a concept of dependency injection. So what actually is dependency injection? To fully understand, or for me to fully explain this thing, I'm going to divide this thing into two parts: the part of dependency and then the part of injection. So let's focus on the first part of dependency. What is dependency? So dependency is more of like an object relying on another object, meaning another object needs another object to fully work. Right? So I'm going to try to simplify this thing, to explain this thing pretty fast. So let's say, for example, we have three classes, on which the first class is A, B, and C. And then we say B is dependent on A, meaning if we want to use B, we're going to have to create an object of A. I hope that won't make sense. So now let's move to the next part, on which the next part will be this diagram. So as you can see on the screen, I have like a diagram on which the first thing we see the core, application, infrastructure, and the web. So if you have watched my video about onion architecture, it should be easy for you to recall what these things are. So in simple, they are called layers. So as you can see, there's some arrows on which we explained what these arrows mean on the previous video about the onion architecture. You should go back and check it out if you haven't. So this shows the flow of dependency through the layers, right? And then as you can see, each and every layer has its own class, on which the core has a class called main, the application has dependent, infrastructure has dependent one, and then the web we have index page, on which I think is the name of the class. Let me try to edit this thing. I think we have something like this. So what is basically happening here is that index page, it needs to use this method called create, on which the create is within a class called dependent one, right? Meaning if we want to use create, we have to create an object of dependent one within this class so that we can access this thing, only to find out that dependent one is also dependent on dependent. Meaning to use this thing, we also have to provide an object of dependent through the constructor, and then also discover that dependent is also dependent on the main class. Hope it makes sense. So you can see that we need to create an object of this thing just to use this thing. It's a lot of work, right? I'm going to show you. I have an application that I've built, that I've wrote so far, and then it does have this process that I'm talking about. You'll see now. So this is basically what we're going to be discussing, right? So this is more of about dependence, showing you what is dependence, how are classes or layers dependent on each other. Now we're going to focus on the part of injection, on which injection basically it's about providing those objects to whatever object that needs it. Meaning since the index page needs dependent, we're going to have to create an object of dependent one and then provide it to the index page or class, right? So now we're going to go to the project that I've created, on which will simply make you understand what is actually happening. So I'm going to start with the main. So as you can see, this is our project structure, and then we have the core. So the core has a class called main, on which when you create an object of main, this thing will be wrote, on which you say main constructor called. Same applies to the infrastructure. Okay, let's go to application. The application is dependent, as I've shown you, and then as you can see, dependent is dependent on the main, meaning when you want to create an object of dependent, you have to provide what? A main class, an object of main to this thing through the constructor. So now we move to the infrastructure. As you can see, infrastructure have class called dependent one, on which dependent one is dependent on what? On the class called dependent, and then you have to provide it through a constructor. So once you create an object of this thing, this message will be printed out on the screen. And then finally, the method that we're looking for, it is called create, on which this method is the method that we're trying to call from where? From the view, on which is a web application, through the class called index model. Oh, I called it index page by mistake. So it's index model. So now, as you can see, when we get the page, meaning once we run the application, this is the first thing that we built, right? We are logging what? We are logging this function, right? Because as you can see, dependent one, remember something, dependent one is from the infrastructure layer. So we created an object. So here, as you can see, we're just creating an object. So we created an object, but we have not instantiated it yet. So we instantiate the object here, but we remember that dependent one is dependent on what? On dependent class. So we created another object called dependent, and then this dependent class, we remember it is dependent on what? On the main object. Then we created another object called main. We provide it through the constructor. We provide dependent here as a parameter. So now we can fully use this thing. So you might be asking yourself, what would happen if we just decide not to provide an object on which another object is dependent on? So for example, we know that dependent is dependent on the main. So what will happen if you just remove this thing and then delete this thing? We'll get an error that says there is no argument given that corresponds to the required parameter main of. So meaning we have to create an object of main and then provide it here, right? So that's what we did. So as you can see, this is a lot of work, but let me tell you something. This is just a bit of what could go worse when you build a project. So you might be wondering what could go worse than writing this terrible code. So as you can see, just imagine if this one had 10 dependencies, meaning you're gonna have to stack your constructor with a lot of objects on which it'll be tedious. All right, so let me show you the worst part. What could really happen? So this is what could really happen. So let's say, for example, you realize that now there's something that you've missed. You want your dependent one to depend on another class, meaning you're gonna what? You're gonna go to the dependent one and then be like, hey, I want you to depend on dependent 3. Meaning you're gonna do something like this, and then here you're gonna say, when you create this object, provide an object of dependent 3. Look what's gonna happen. So you get an error. What this error means, let me tell you this thing. It's not really yes. Okay, so as you can see, we get an error, meaning we change something on which we also have to make a change here. So now we get a message. There is no argument given that corresponds to the required parameter dependent 3. So now we have to create an object of dependent 3 and then provide it here. Let's do that. Dependent 3 is equals to new dependent 3. Then we come here, we provide what? Dependent 3. We managed to solve the problem. So the question is, why do we have to, when we make a change on one class, why do we have to go back and make a change everywhere we've implemented the thing? Is it really necessary for us to do this thing? This shows a bad habit of a program or a developer. You should never see yourself implementing this kind of way. I don't know what this thing is. This practice is bad. Just keep it like that. Remove yourself from this kind of practices. So now the question becomes, what is the main purpose of this thing, of this video? So the main purpose of this video is to prevent you guys from implementing such monolithic code like this. This is a mess. So how do we prevent this thing? So what is actually dependency injection in .NET? So .NET has come up with something called dependency injection, as this video is about. So what is happening is that we do have something called a service container, on which you just provide the name of the class within you register the class within the container, and then every time when you need the implementation on an object or an object of that class, you just do something like this. You just do something like this. You just provide this thing and then do this thing, and then that's it. And then once you're done like this, when you use it here, you wouldn't need all these things. Okay, it might be pretty confusing. You'll understand what I'm talking about. So let's go to the diagram. So as you can see, this thing requires this thing, and this thing requires this thing, and this thing requires this thing. So now we're going to create something called, okay, let me show you what .NET did. So .NET created something called the service contain. So let's call it a service. So we have a service contain. So what is happening is that to fully fulfill dependency injection, we have to register all these things here. How do we do that? I'm going to show you. So what is happening is that we are trying to do something of like taking this thing into this thing. Sorry. Into this thing, and then this thing into this thing also, and then this thing into this thing. So as you can see, we're trying to not this one. This one is not to be registered on this thing. Yeah, that's it. This is what dependency injection is about. It's about registering whatever service that another service needs in a service container. So when you build our project and then .NET sees that we require this thing, what it will do, it will go inside the service container and check if we have this thing. And then once it sees that this thing exists, then what is going to happen is that .NET is going to provide us an object of this thing. And then remember something, also this thing is dependent on this thing, meaning it is also going to provide an object of this thing inside this thing. I hope I make sense on that one. So now we're going to try to rewrite our code so that it applies whatever we are talking about here. So let's go back to the code. So this is a mess, right? So as you can see, this, to be honest, this is a mess. So now we're going to be removing a lot of code here. So we only need dependent one, right? Let's delete this thing. So as you can see, we have a messed up code here. So let's try to debug to build this thing. Okay, let's add some stuff. So let's see. Okay, let me go back. So let's say the name build this. Oh, come on. So now let's build this thing, see what's going to happen. Okay. Okay, so as you can see, the project was able to build, right? So now let's try to run this thing. This will be interesting. Pay attention to what's going to happen. So we run this thing. Give it a sec, give it a sec. Look, we get an exception. So object reference not set to instance of object, meaning we haven't yet created an object of this thing. So that one was expected, right? So now let's go back to the main thing of like registering those classes to the service container so that we just simplify the whole process. So how does dependency injection works? So I'm going to show you now. So remember something, we need an object of this thing, right? So what we're going to do to apply dependency injection, we're just going to say dependent one, right? And then do something like dependent one is equal to dependent one. That's what it takes. This is exactly what it takes to just apply dependency injection. Look, everything now is simplified. So now let's run this thing. Let's build and run this thing. So let's see what's going to happen. We get an error. Envelope operation unable to resolve service for type infrastructure dependent one. Alright. So what does this thing mean? So what .NET said realizes that, okay, as we can see here, we just provided this class through the constructor, right? So automatically when .NET sees this kind of thing, it goes straight to the service container and check if or ever we have something of this type. And then by the time we're building this thing, .NET realized no, there's no such service that has been registered within the service container. Then it thrown this exception that says unable to resolve service type of, meaning .NET has tried to look for a class called dependent1 within the service and it has never found it. Now we go back to the question of how do we register this thing within the service? Now we go to the code again, then we go to the program.cs. So as you can see, there's a comment here that says add services to the container, right? So how do we do that? So first of all, I'm going to create a variable called services, on which services is equals to builder.services, right? And then if you want to read more about, you can just go there and check the implementation, what the services is and all that thing, right? So otherwise, let's go back to this thing. So now we want to register what is it, dependent1 service to the service container, right? So what we're going to do is that we're going to say services .NET.add. So we're going to be using scope, and then now we're going to be providing our class on which is what it is dependent1. And then so now we've fully managed to register what dependent1 within the service container, right? So now let's try to run this thing. Let me just minimize this thing. Let's see what's going to happen. Whoa, an exception. So what's happening here? So they say some services are not able to be constructed. All right. Basically, what this thing says, say unable to resolve service of type application dependent while attempting to activate dependent1, meaning okay, this thing is no longer saying it can't find dependent1 because we registered it. Now it is saying it can't find what dependent, because remember something, dependent1 is dependent on dependent, so meaning we have to register what the dependent thing. Now we're just going to say dependent, right? So now let's do this. Okay, now let's run it again and see what's gonna happen. Sometimes I'm down. Hurry up. Okay, seems like there's another exception. Unable to resolve series of type call me. So as you can see, this thing is trying to go through the process of dependence. Since remember something, this one is dependent on this one, and then this one is dependent on this one, and this one is dependent on the main, right? So now as you can see, is that it says that unable to resolve series of type call main, right? Because it was trying to create an object of this thing, and then this thing is dependent on the main. So now let's finish this thing. Now let's finish this thing and then provide the main. So now we are done. So now let's try to run this thing and see what's going to happen. Okay, fine. Oh, shit. Okay, so basically this is what it takes to register your classes as a service or to the service container. It's nothing much, and then look how much it simplifies our life. Right? So okay, so now there is what? There is some problem. Oh, there's also dependent 3. Oh. So it seems like we have a lot of dependencies in here. So dependent 3. So let's try it again. I forgot about it one. Totally forgot about it. So building. Let's see another exception. No exception, meaning the project runs perfectly fine. The question is, will it still do the things it used to do? Let's go check the code. So as you can see, everything that happened before, this happening again. So look, If I were to change something, let's say I were to add, change anything. If I want to add another dependency here, all I'll have to do is just that I'll have to register that thing on a service. That's it. Meaning, if I won't have to create an object here, no, that's way too low, bro. So it's like a better way of doing things. So that's it about dependency injection. So I hope you're gonna be using this principle or taking advantage of this. I don't know, this is so amazing, simplifies the whole lot of things. So anyway guys, thank you for watching. See you in the next upcoming videos. Cheers.